Can we trust the New Testament as a reliable document? Many skeptics say no, and that it is based on dated copies and filled with errors. But what does the evidence say? Christians for centuries have pointed to the evidence that we can trust the New Testament as reliable to what it originally said. So what evidence can we offer? Well, when it comes to an ancient document, the more manuscripts we have, the better. That way there is more to cross-check for accuracy and identify changes that may have happened through the process known as textual criticism. So we would obviously want more to compare with so we can get back to the original. So what do we have of the New Testament? Of the original language of the New Testament, we've over 5,800 Greek manuscripts. In Latin, we've over 10,000 manuscripts. In various other languages, we have between 5,000 and 10,000 manuscripts. So we have an extremely wide variety of New Testament manuscripts from across the ancient world we can study and compare. And with more manuscripts, the more accurate we will be at reconstructing the original through textual criticism. But even if we didn't have any manuscripts, we would still have the entire New Testament preserved in the writings of the Church Fathers. It is estimated there are over 1 million New Testament quotes in the Church Fathers alone. If there was a large amount of intentional or accidental corruption of the text, then it would be easy to trace by comparing manuscripts of different regions.
There was never a time when any one man or group of men had control over the text of the New Testament. There was never a Christian Uthman. All assertions regarding adding doctrines, changing theology, removing teachings, etc. are without merit. The Christian church was a persecuted minority without power to enforce a uniform textual transmission, as in Islam.
This is far more than any other ancient document. The second most widely attested would be Homer's Iliad, with only 1,757 copies, and then Suetonius with around 200 copies. So if one is still skeptical of the New Testament after knowing of how widely attested it is, then they should be even more skeptical of other ancient works. As scholar Dan Wallace says,
they have never thought about this other ancient literature and reflecting on what that would be like. If I'm going to be skeptical about the New Testament and I apply that skepticism to other ancient Greco-Roman literature, guess what? We immediately go back into the Dark Ages. We've eclipsed all knowledge in the last 500 years.
But not only do we have a large amount of manuscripts, but we have very early complete manuscripts and even earlier fragments. The oldest complete New Testament is within 300 years of the original, the closest of any ancient document. But we have even earlier witnesses and fragments, like this one, P52, from between 90 AD to 125 AD, and others like these, from approximately 170 AD to 220 AD. We also have a larger fragment from around this time in P75, which has 102 survived pages from Luke and John. Comparing this to other ancient documents, the earliest copy of the Iliad is far off with 500 years from its original, and Suetonius is 800 years from its original. As you can see, the New Testament is by far the closest to its original than any other ancient document. So if we are to be skeptical of the New Testament, then we should be even more skeptical of other ancient literature. In fact, we have about a dozen fragmented manuscripts dating to around the 2nd century, which represent about 40% of the entire New Testament, and we have 120 manuscripts around 300 years from the original, which is incredible compared to other ancient documents. But despite this, some scholars still argue the New Testament copies are too late and full of errors. The leading critic Bart Ehrman says, "Not only do we not have the originals, we don't have the first copies of the originals. We don't even have copies of the original, or copies of the originals. What we have are copies made later, much later, and these copies all differ from one another in many thousands of places." Well, this seems like an odd thing to say, given the evidence we just discussed. So let's divide his objection into two parts and deal with each appropriately. The first is that our earliest manuscripts are extremely far off from the originals, not even copies of the originals. Well, this doesn't make sense, considering our earliest fragment is within 70 years or less of the original, and several larger fragments are around 150 years from the original. So why would these not be 1st or 2nd generation copies of the originals? A papyrus manuscript in public use will last on average for more than 100 years. There is also no reason to assume the originals or 1st generation copies were copied once and thrown away or lost. In fact, Ehrman even acknowledges that a manuscript can likely be a direct copy of one from 100 years prior to it.
Every time somebody translates the Bible, they don't say, well, I've got to take this manuscript that I translated from and destroy that now. That's stupid. We don't do that. It's never been done in the history of the church.
There is no reason to assume the originals were just copied once and forgotten, or that scribes only had one copy to pull from. In fact, early church father Tertullian even seems to suggest the originals were still around when he was writing at the end of the 2nd century. Come now, you who would indulge a better curiosity, if you would apply it to the business of your salvation, run over to the apostolic churches, in which the very thrones of the apostles are still preeminent in their places, in which their own authentic writings are read. The Latin word for authentic normally refers to original documents, so it appears Tertullian is saying the originals were still in the churches to that day. He specifically refers to the letters of Corinthians, Philippians, Thessalonians, Ephesians, and Romans, and urges readers to visit these places to see the authentic writings for themselves. Even if Tertullian didn't mean the original scrolls the apostles wrote on, his testimony still tells us the Christians in his days were concerned with having accurate writings, and they were not discarding their copies as valueless, as skeptics suggest. And it's reasonable to suggest that if the manuscripts were read often, they were also copied often. And in fact, the amount of manuscripts we have today obviously suggests that. Ehrman's reasoning seems to imply New Testament copying was like a game of telephone, where a 4th century copy is a copy from one from a 3rd century, which in turn is a copy of one from the 2nd century, which is a copy of one from the 1st century, which was a copy of the original. But there is no reason to suggest the originals or the first copies were simply lost after they were copied once. Scribes could always go back to the earliest copies of their day that had survived and simply copy that. St. Irenaeus even testifies he had access to some of the earliest copies of the Book of Revelations, suggesting early copies were being preserved for accuracy and transmission. And the testimony of early church fathers indicates how sacred they consider these documents, so they were not carelessly being copied, but being held in high regard to preserve the faith passed down from the apostles. In fact, scholars Darrell Bach and Dan Wallace note the earliest manuscripts we have probably go back to around 100 AD. Two of the oldest manuscripts we have, Papyrus 75 or P75 and Codex Vaticanus or B, have an exceptionally strong agreement, and they are among the most accurate manuscripts that exist today. P75 is about 125 years older than B, yet it is not an ancestor of B. Instead, B was copied from an earlier manuscript of P75. See the detailed work of C.L. Porter. The combination of these two manuscripts in a particular reading must surely go back to the very beginning of the 2nd century. So the idea that our copies are far too late doesn't stand up to evidence, and textual criticism demonstrates we are not too far off from the originals. So what about Ehrman's other claim, that all other manuscripts have much variation and differ from one another in thousands of places? Ehrman and other skeptics will usually throw out the fact that there are 400,000 variants across New Testament manuscripts, which is in fact true. However, when you look at the details, this isn't a big deal. For example, the reason we have so many variants is because we have so many manuscripts. That would be expected with such a high number of manuscripts. But even with that, remember we have close to 6,000 New Testament Greek manuscripts, which comes to about 2.6 million pages of New Testament. If you do the math, that is one variant per 6.5 pages. Not really that much. Second, what kinds of variants are there? Well, 75% of them are simply spelling errors, which do not affect the meaning of the text. 15% are variation in Greek synonyms and transpositions, which cannot even be translated. About 9% do affect the meaning of the text, but they are from very late documents, and obviously resolved by looking at earlier manuscripts. Then, less than 1% do actually affect the meaning of the text and are from early manuscripts. But none of these variants actually challenge or affect essential Christian doctrines, as Bart Ehrman even admits. The position I argue for in misquoting Jesus does not actually stand at odds with Professor Metzger's position that the essential Christian beliefs are not affected by textual variants in the manuscript tradition of the New Testament.
This is the guy on whose works Muslims and atheists are basing their wild claims that the Orthodox have so corrupted the text that it must not have been Orthodox at all originally. They don't know what they're talking about, but they're basing it on Dr. Ehrman's work. He does know what he's talking about. I happen to disagree with him about a number of things, but I don't disagree with him over this. In fact, in our 3 debates, at the end of each debate, I say, by the way, I think you agree with me, Bart, that essential Christian beliefs are not affected by textual variants. And I put this screen up. He's never disputed it. He said it. It's in print. He can't deny himself.
There is absolutely no evidence to suggest Christian doctrines are affected by variants in the manuscripts, and there is next to zero evidence to suggest we cannot get back to the originals. In fact, given all the evidence, there are only 40 lines of the New Testament unresolved by textual criticism, giving it an accuracy of 99.5%, which by far is the best of any ancient document, Now obviously, there is still debate over what a handful of passages were originally, and no Christian scholar argues we have exactly word for word what the original authors wrote. But in light of this evidence, we should also avoid radical skepticism that we can certainly never know anything of what the original authors wrote. It simply doesn't stand up to evidence. The overwhelming amount of scriptural passages aren't even debated, and there is no textual evidence that threatens the origins of essential Christian doctrines. So is the New Testament reliable? The obvious answer is yes, and we have barely scratched the surface of evidence.
The onus is on the skeptic. The New Testament sets the standard in providing clear evidence of its trustworthiness. If that is not enough, is it possible the skeptic has set a standard that is unreasonable? And if so, why?
Is there textual corruption of the New Testament? The obvious answer is yes, but how much, and is it a serious problem for Christianity? In the introduction of this series, we pointed out there are about 40 lines of the New Testament unresolved by textual criticism, giving it an accuracy of 99.5%. But does the fact that we do not have 100% certainty pose theological or textual problems for Christians? Surprisingly, some skeptics will say that since we do not have 100% certainty, this means we can never know what the original text said. Well, there are two problems with this. The first is that it is self-refuting. If it is true we can never know, then we also cannot know with certainty that we can say we can never know. In other words, to claim it is absolutely true, we can never know what the New Testament was originally, is to claim you have some special knowledge that everyone else lacks and know it is truly lost. But how would you know that? The other issue is it undermines all of historical investigation. If we can never know, then what's the point of academic historical studies? Why not give up on all historical investigation and eclipse all knowledge we have of history? The fact is, all historical or even scientific investigation can never yield 100% certainty. Our goal is to arrive at the most logical and parsimonious explanation, which is what we do in other areas of investigation. Why set the bar to an unreasonable standard with the New Testament if you're not going to do it with other areas as well? Scholars argue the originals are still in the manuscript tradition, and through textual criticism, we can rebuild what the original said. There are some better objections than this paranoid one. One used by skeptics is extrapolation. Basically, the highest rate of variance is in our earliest manuscripts from the 3rd and 2nd century. So extrapolating backwards means there is even higher variation in earlier manuscripts we don't have. Well, there are several problems with this. The first is it is an association fallacy. The scribal habits of copyists from the 3rd and 2nd century doesn't necessarily apply to earlier copyists. This objection also discounts the originals and first-generation copies would still be around to cross-check for accuracy during this time. And particularly, in the 1st century, many of the apostles and members of the first church would also still be around to prevent doctrinal changes. Finally, this objection ends up getting us nowhere. If we extrapolate variation in our manuscripts backwards, we also have to extrapolate the percentages based on what we do have, as discussed in the introduction. So the 0% of doctrinal changes is still 0%, based on estimated increases of what we have. Doesn't really do the skeptic any good. But didn't the earliest generations of Christians not consider these documents to be sacred, so they would not have been careful with copying? This objection is silly, because even a copyist of a secular document was careful to make sure it was accurately transmitted. This was not a frivolous task for anyone. It can also be challenged if the first Christians considered these works scriptural or not. Early writers like Clement, Ignatius, Polycarp, and Justin Martyr quote the New Testament several times. Polycarp even refers to the letter of Ephesians as scripture, and Justin Martyr even refers to the New Testament writings as the memoirs of the apostles. So there is evidence in early Christian writings that show they would have at least considered the writings of the New Testament to be authoritative and deserving of respect. The basic point to remember is if anyone wants to argue the New Testament has been drastically changed, that requires evidence. Paranoid suspicion doesn't cut it. New Testament documents were spread all over the ancient world, and we have recovered several manuscripts from the 2nd and 3rd century in various regions during times of great persecution and no political power. There was never any central control over the New Testament, and no ability to produce drastic changes. Manuscripts lost to that time period have been rediscovered today, and they would have revealed doctrinal changes in the current text we have, but none of them actually show this. What history demonstrates is, as James White says, there were multiple lines of transmission coming out of the 1st century, all confirming the same message.
and that he has preserved it through the entire manuscript tradition so that there's never a controlling authority that can change or edit the text, put in doctrines, take out doctrines, etc., etc. The result of that is we have to look at textual variants. But the fact is, that is the best way to preserve the text, especially given the evangelical mandate of the early church. So the idea that, well, if there was these primitive corruptions before the manuscript tradition is found in history, therefore we can never know what the originals were. When you have multiple lines, how do all those multiple lines end up having the same readings in them? Not identical readings, but it's still the same New Testament. It's still teaching the same things.
The burden is on the skeptic. The Christian can stand on what historical evidence has revealed. But what about the variants that we do have? Well, as discussed, the vast majority do not affect the meaning of the text and cannot even be translated. The many that do affect the meaning of the text are from late manuscripts and resolved by textual criticism. There are only a few, less than 1% of all variants, that do affect the meaning of the text and are from early manuscripts. Dan Wallace estimates there are about 1,000 total. But even most of these are not even a real major issue. For example, one unresolved textual variant is 1 Thessalonians 2:7, where Paul says we either became gentle or little children among you. The difference in Greek between the two is one letter, and both could fit with the context. Another is Romans 5:1, where Paul either says, let us have peace with God, or we have peace with God. Again, the difference is one letter, and both make sense with the context. But do either of these variants really affect Christian theology, regardless of which one is right? Of course not. So no variant is affecting theology. It is affecting our understanding of select passages, as Dan Wallace says.
The question that we're asking is not which one fits into Pauline theology, but which one fits into that passage. And so the value of knowing about these textual variants is how they affect our exegesis and our exposition, not how they affect our theology.
Beyond this, there are only about 7 popular variants that skeptics bring up. Well, really only 6. No reputable scholar questions if this reading of 1 John 5:7 was in the original. It was clearly a late addition that came over from the Latin, and is not in any early Greek manuscripts. This verse doesn't do much good for support of the Trinity either, since it doesn't explain the doctrine or the nature of each member, and it is so vague it could be used to support modalism, or even Arianism really. Early church fathers argued for the Trinity without the need for this verse, and we've demonstrated in another series the Trinity is confirmed throughout Scripture. So the absence of this verse doesn't threaten the Christian doctrine of the Trinity. So what about John 1:18? Some manuscripts say the only Son, and some say the only God, which a scholar's note would simply mean culturally, he who is God himself. Does either reading change Christian doctrine? No. John affirms Jesus is God in several places, and that he is the Son of God. Either reading would be fine, and this doesn't affect Christian doctrine. What about Matthew 24:36? Some of our earliest manuscripts omit nor the Son. Does this change our fundamental understanding of Jesus if he did know the time of the coming tribulation? Well, it is debatable if the phrase nor the Son was in the original reading of Matthew or not. But even if it wasn't, it doesn't affect Christian doctrine, since the parallel reading found in Mark 13:32 has no textual doubt from early manuscripts. Plus, this verse still says only the Father knows, so lacking this phrase doesn't affect our understanding of Jesus or affect Christian doctrine. So let's move on to Mark 1:41. An early manuscript from the 5th century and a few Latin ones claim this verse says Jesus moved with anger to heal a leper, not that he moved with compassion. External evidence favors the majority reading, but some scholars do in fact believe anger was the original reading from internal evidence of the text. But is this variant a problem for our portrait of Jesus? Not really, since other passages in Mark depict Jesus as being angry, and there is no variation with them in manuscripts. There is nothing inconsistent with the Jesus who gets angry anyway. In fact, internally speaking, one can argue an angry Jesus makes more sense with the passage, since prior to this, it records Jesus was preaching in the synagogue, so the healing was public. A leper was considered ritually unclean, and anyone who came in contact with him would also be considered unclean and must leave the public to remain in the wilderness for a time. And Mark records after this had happened, Jesus had to go into the wilderness once the word got out that he had healed a leper. Having to heal the leper publicly meant Jesus' ministry in Galilee was being hindered by being ritually unclean. The leper could have waited to be healed privately and could have honored Jesus' request to keep it unknown. So it is reasonable that Jesus would be angry about this. As Bach and Wallace say, Becoming angry only strengthens the image we see of Jesus in this gospel by making it wholly consistent with the other texts that speak of his anger. It doesn't significantly alter the picture we have of Jesus, but instead strengthens what Mark says elsewhere. So now let's move on to Hebrews 2:9. Most manuscripts say Jesus died by the grace of God, whereas 3 from the 10th century say he died apart from God. Plus, many early church fathers seem to affirm this reading, as well as a few later translated manuscripts. But how does this affect Christian doctrine? Do not several passages say Christ's death was given to us by the grace of God? Doesn't Scripture teach Jesus died apart from God, or that without God's help Jesus experienced death on behalf of all humanity? Strong cases can be made for either reading, but either way, whichever was original, the variant doesn't affect Christian doctrine. So finally, we will look at the 2 largest variants. John chapter 8 and the long ending of Mark do not appear in our early manuscripts, and I know of very few scholars that consider them authentic. Some arguments can be made for their possible authenticity, but that is not the point of this video. The point is, even considering that these texts were probably not in the originals, removing them still doesn't change any Christian doctrine. As Bach and Wallace say, it needs to be stressed that these passages change no fundamental doctrine, no core belief, even though much emotional baggage is attached to them. The probability of their not having been part of the original text has been understood for more than a century, yet no theological formulations have been altered. So none of these variants are really a threat, and we need to remember no disputed variants are hidden from Christians, and just about any study Bible will put notes on the side saying that some manuscripts differ here or there. This is not secret information for anyone who has done their homework, because there is no reason to keep it a secret. But does the fact that there is variation in our manuscripts pose a problem in itself? Aren't we supposed to have the inerrant Word of God, preserving every letter for all time? I think this is a drastic claim that some modern Christians and skeptics have put forward, but this view of Scripture was not even kept by the early church or the apostles. The real purpose of the New Testament was to preserve the faith handed down from the apostles, not to create an inerrant relic, as some have turned the Bible into. The apostles didn't even apply this standard. Look at how they quote the Old Testament. Most of the time they quote from the Greek Septuagint, but there are times when they quote from the Hebrew Masoretic text and variations between them. They didn't expect every single word to be perfect for it to be an authoritative witness of the faith handed down. The point of the New Testament is to preserve the message of Christ and what he did for us, and it has been with a 99.5% accuracy, as the evidence shows. Remember, it is the gospel that saves, not perfect copying. I'll leave you with the words of scholar Craig Evans. Let me put it this way. What did Peter and the other original followers of Jesus proclaim following the experience of the resurrection? Peter and the rest of the apostles proclaimed the resurrection of Jesus. For them, this was the good news. This was conclusive evidence that God was at work in the ministry in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. Peter didn't stand up and proclaim, "Men of Israel, I have good news. The Bible is verbally inspired and therefore inerrant, and moreover, the Gospels can be harmonized." It was the reality of the resurrection and its impact on those who heard and responded to it in faith that propelled the New Testament forward, not mistake-free Scripture. Before the New Testament was written down, it was transmitted and preserved through an oral tradition. We've already explained in this series the transmission of the New Testament through manuscripts is reliable, but what about the oral transmission before it was written down? The moment skeptics hear this, they immediately assume it is unreliable and go right to the analogy of the telephone game. How can the New Testament be reliable if it was preserved through word of mouth? Wouldn't doctrinal changes be easy to insert? The problem is this is really one giant attempt to judge another completely different culture with our own Western cultural views. People in the modern West have a hard time understanding how ancient people could retain large amounts of detailed teachings, since we live in a culture that is flooded with written information and several ways to record and reference things. Ancient people didn't have this technology, and instead used various techniques to train their memories to retain vast amounts of detailed information. Using these techniques today, combined with hard work and dedication, can yield the same strong memory skills. The Talmud describes an ideal student should be as a well-plastered cistern, which would not let even a single drop escape. Ancient Jews were capable of memorizing large amounts of scripture, and ancient Greek storytellers were able to memorize the entire Iliad or Odyssey. The other point is the transmission of important stories and teachings through oral tradition doesn't compare at all to the modern version of the telephone game. The point of the telephone game is to skew the message for a good laugh. It is transmitted secretly from one ear to the next, and there is no chance to hear the message repeatedly before it is passed on. This is not a good representation of how the transmission of important teachings were preserved through oral tradition. Ancient cultures transmitted oral teachings and sacred beliefs in the open for the whole tribe or community to hear, and it was repeated many times for all those present to memorize. If someone would skew the message during reciting, the whole community would be present to correct errors.
If you go back 2,000 years, oral tradition was the way that sacred beliefs, personal family information, tribal and national patriotic traditions were passed along. Education was almost entirely by rote memorization. It was not unusual for Greek school children to have Homer's Iliad or Odyssey or large portions of it committed to memory, or for young Jewish boys to have large parts of the Hebrew Scriptures, what Christians call the Old Testament, committed to memory.
Most of all, it is important to look at what scholars actually say regarding oral tradition. Do academic scholars and historians who have studied oral tradition in various cultures treat it like the telephone game? Hardly. In fact, they say many in the West have overlooked the value and preservation that can be found in oral transmission among various cultures. Tony Lentz says, Western academic measurement of success by literacy and printed research colored the expectation of classical scholars as they considered writing in ancient culture. Writing was so important to their world that they assumed it was key to the growth of ancient culture. Johannan Draper says, embedded oral forms and traditions allow people to remember astonishing amounts of material, while at the same time ensuring that the material is to some extent fluid and adaptable. For instance, the praise poems of the Zulu kings, collected by Trevor Cope, show both stability and partial verbatim agreement from one performance to another, but also considerable variety in the ordering and choice of possible components to suit the occasion. Kenneth Bailey worked for years in the Middle East and speaks of people retaining large amounts to memory and accurately preserving historical data orally for several years. We are here observing a community that can create over the centuries and sustain in current usage up to 6,000 wisdom sayings. Notice he said the community preserved the sayings. It was not dependent on one man, but on a collective group working together to preserve the tradition. Scholars note ancient people put a strong emphasis on memorization and developed several techniques for training one's memory. David Carr notes in Mesopotamia, more advanced students appear to have learned through a process of dictation and recitation. Students not only had to memorize individual elements of standard works, but also had to be able to place the text they had memorized in the correct order. This is very similar to how modern actors are able to memorize large amounts of lines and monologues to recite on stage. Ancient teachers would often repeat their teachings over and over and have their students repeat it back to them so they would commit it to memory. People from the ancient world up to the medieval world put such a strong emphasis on memory that Mary Carruthers says, a person without memory, if such a thing could be, would be a person without moral character and in the basic sense, without humanity. And this was no exception in ancient Judea. David Carr notes Josephus recorded Jews could recite their laws easier than their own names. It was not uncommon for a Jew to have the entire Old Testament memorized by age 14. They took the book of Proverbs seriously when it said to write the law on the tablet of their heart. This was a culture that Jesus and the apostles were born and raised in. Memorization of large amounts of teachings in Scripture was the standard, so there is no reason to assume the disciples of Jesus could not retain and memorize large amounts of his teachings. Such a duty would have been expected in becoming a disciple of a rabbi. With that being said, we must recognize there are two forms of oral tradition, controlled and uncontrolled. A controlled oral tradition means that the material is memorized and identified as a preserved tradition. It is not meant to change, but be preserved. Whereas an uncontrolled oral tradition is a living tradition, which is subject to variations as the community or tribe needs. There is no set teacher and no control within which the material is passed from one person to another, and is open to additions. So the question becomes, what was the New Testament? A controlled or uncontrolled tradition? The obvious solution is to look at the surviving texts of the earliest Christians and see how they viewed the words of Jesus, and see if we can find structures for memory enhancement. If memory enhancing structures exist in the text, we have a clear indication the text was meant to be memorized and preserved, not changed throughout time. There is in fact plenty of evidence in the New Testament which indicates a controlled tradition. First, we already indicated the culture they were raised in put a strong emphasis on memorization and preserving tradition. But also, Jesus taught in much the same way Jewish rabbis of his day taught. A pupil-teacher relationship with his disciples. He spent time instructing them and expected them to obey and imitate him. Samuel Breiskog notes, Jesus expected his disciples to use him as a model. More importantly, the disciples and early Christians considered Jesus God's divine agent. His words would have been considered sacred. As Harold Reisenfeld said, the words and deeds of Jesus are a holy word, comparable with that of the Old Testament, and the handing out of this precious material is entrusted to special persons. On top of that, we find several techniques in the New Testament for enhancing memorization. First, Jesus taught lessons through stories and visuals. He is constantly explaining his message in parables, which are easier to memorize. Most common people today can explain some of the most popular parables, like the Good Samaritan or the Prodigal Sons. Teaching this way allows one to memorize easier. He also gave visuals in shorter lessons. Examples like Mark 10:25, where it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to enter heaven. Or like Matthew 7, where Jesus speaks in hyperbole of getting the log out of your eye before getting the speck out of someone else's. These visuals are frequent throughout the Gospels. Third, Jesus used elements of wordplay. In Matthew 23, Jesus gives a retort to the Pharisees, straining out a gnat and swallowing a camel. The Aramaic words were likely chosen because of the play on similarities and rhythmic delivery. Fourth, and most important, scholars like Robert Stein and David Edward Ahn estimate 80% of Jesus' teachings are what you would call a parallelismus membarum, which is to give a sentence in a similar form so that the passage has a pattern and rhythm. There are several examples we could point to, like Luke 11:9, "Ask and it will be given to you, seek and you will find it, knock and it will be opened to you," or Matthew 7:17, "Every healthy tree bears good fruit, but the diseased tree bears bad fruit." There is an overwhelming amount of research which points this out. Thus, there is an overwhelming amount of evidence which indicates Jesus taught a controlled tradition in a way to enhance memorization. This should be pretty obvious to our culture, since many modern catchphrases we could rattle off the top of our heads come from Christ, such as "go an extra mile," "being a prodigal son," or "a wolf in sheep's clothing." Now, skeptics may try to argue these passages were made up years later by the church. However, that is a baseless conjecture. A community creating an uncontrolled tradition would have no need to make up the facade of a controlled tradition in order to fool people hundreds of years later, or put into the text an unnecessary amount of subtle hints and off-the-cuff comments of a controlled oral tradition. The burden is on the skeptic to explain why a community would feel a need to make these things up, because the fact remains, there is plenty of evidence which presents a preserved controlled tradition, and it is far more parsimonious than assuming an elaborate conspiracy without any direct evidence. Plus, if the words of Jesus were made up later to suit the needs of an early Christian community, why don't they reflect actual problems the early church faced? Why were the teachings of Christ not invented to suit their needs, such as later problems like if Gentiles needed to be circumcised, or what was the place for speaking in tongues, or what the resurrected body would be like? If the words of Jesus were later invented to suit the needs of early Christians, why don't we find phrases that suit every need of early Christians? It is clear the teachings of Christ were preserved, not made up to suit the needs of a later community. It is also important to point out this way of teaching will encourage memorization of important doctrines and teachings, not necessarily exact wordings. But as we've seen in part 2 of this series, exact wording is not what is important, but the preservation of the teachings and historical accounts. Variations in delivery can change as long as the same message is given. So when skeptics try to claim it is a huge deal we do not have the exact words Jesus spoke, they miss the point. The New Testament was meant to preserve the teachings of Christ. It is the message of the gospel that saves, not specific words. There is really no difference in message if one reports, "And he entered the temple and began to drive out those who sold," or, "And Jesus entered the temple and drove out all who sold and bought in the temple." As Jocelyn Small says, for oral cultures, it is not the words, but the story or the gist that counts. As long as what was really important was stated, how it was stated was not the issue. As N.T. Wright says, if we come to the ministry of Jesus as first-century historians and forget our 20th century assumptions about mass media, the overwhelming probability is that most of what Jesus said, he said not twice, but 200 times, with of course a myriad of local variations. Evidence for this is seen in Matthew and Luke's different renders of the Lord's Prayer. In Luke, Jesus states it after he is approached by his disciples while praying, and in Matthew, Jesus is reciting it in a Sermon on the Mountain. Christ, of course, ministered for approximately 3 years and would have repeated the same message to different crowds, which would have encouraged memorization among his closest disciples and followers. The essential doctrines and teachings would have been hammered into their memories. As John Wyndham said, "It is exceedingly unlikely that Jesus taught about prayer only once. It is natural that he should have given the Lord's Prayer in his ask, seek, knock sayings more than once, and not always in identical words." Last, there is a clear indication specific eyewitnesses and followers of Jesus were trusted in preserving this tradition. Luke begins his gospel by telling us he received his information from eyewitnesses and ministers of the word. Luke uses the Greek word huperetes, which is the Greek word for the Hebrew word hazan. The hazan in Judea was responsible for keeping the scrolls in the synagogue. So in Luke 1:2, we read he received his information from the hazans of the word. The usage of the single definite article in Luke makes it likely that these were carefully selected eyewitnesses who were trusted with keeping the oral tradition in check. Therefore, we have evidence the tradition was protected and preserved by designated authoritative eyewitnesses.
If you remember in Acts chapter 1, when Judas is being replaced, the requirement for his replacement is that he had to be with the ministry from the beginning. And the reason is that the apostles had a role in overseeing this tradition. In fact, Luke refers to those who orally reported the tradition in the churches as those who are eyewitnesses and ministers of the word from the beginning. So this role of the apostles exercises a control in how this material is being passed on from church to church.
Even if all this evidence was not available, the idea that Christian doctrines and accounts of Jesus drastically changed before they were written down is refuted by the fact that scholars have identified several early oral creeds and hymns quoted in the New Testament. These creeds and hymns demonstrate a preserved oral tradition that predate Paul's letters. If Paul was writing between the 40s and 60s, then he is quoting creeds and beliefs which existed prior to this. Most notably, the overwhelming majority of scholars date the creed preserved in 1 Corinthians 15 to within 3 years of Pentecost, which, as Gary Habermas points out, preserves the core doctrines of Christ's death, resurrection, and divinity. Therefore, we have evidence of essential Christian doctrines in creeds written down by Paul that existed before the New Testament was written. This is by far the closest we get with any ancient document. The fact that some of our material is dated to within 3 years of the source is unheard of with other ancient literature. But even if these creeds did not exist, the idea the oral tradition would have been corrupted is unsupported and is nothing but paranoid suspicion. Scholars estimate the reliability of an oral tradition can last for over a century before we could expect corruption to seep in. Gilbert Garahan says it cannot go past 150 years. Marlene Kiklamani sets the limit at 200 years. This is well within the time frame of when the New Testament was written down, even if we take the latest dates for when the books were written. Therefore, when we actually look at the evidence, we see there is no reason to doubt the oral tradition of the New Testament, and there is plenty of evidence that indicates its reliability. If the New Testament was written by the apostles, is there any evidence the books can be dated to within the apostles' lifetime? And is there any evidence they were written by the people who they are credited to? We've already discussed the oral tradition of the New Testament, and that it can be reliable even up to the late dates of the Gospels. But are not some of these dates too late to have been written by the actual apostles? Well, first, we need to discuss why many historians date them so late. The main reason is based on a twofold argument. First, Mark is assumed to be the first gospel because it is the shortest. Matthew and Luke are said to be based off of Mark, so they must have come later. And John came last from an independent source. Then, historians point out Mark 13 is a vivid prophecy by Jesus of the destruction of the temple and the surrounding events, which took place in 70 AD. So since the author of Mark speaks so clearly about this event, he must have had prior knowledge of it to be so accurate. I believe this argument is based on a presupposition that Jesus could not have been who he claimed to be. Therefore, he could not have made an accurate prediction that was fulfilled in 70 AD. Therefore, we have to date the Gospels after 70 AD, since Jesus could not predict the future. Not only is that starting with a presupposition, it doesn't seem fair to the text, since there is a lot of evidence which leads to early dates for the Gospels. It could just be that Jesus was echoing the first destruction of the temple by Babylon, and even from a secular standpoint, atheist Maurice Casey argues extensively that Mark 13 should be dated to around 40 AD. Second, it is assumed Mark was first because it is the shortest. However, oral tradition specialist Albert Lord points out oral narrative parallels that we have found doesn't necessarily mean the shorter version is older. It may be the result of practical constraints. Those who argue Matthew was written first argue Mark was shortened for a Gentile audience who would not understand the prophecies of the Old Testament being fulfilled in the Jewish context Matthew constantly refers to. But that is a topic for another video. Third, there is actually a lot of external and internal evidence which suggests the Gospels were written by the men who they are credited to. Looking at the external evidence, the early church fathers are unanimous that the Gospel of Matthew was written by the disciple Matthew. Mark was written by Mark, the interpreter of Peter in Rome. Luke was written by Luke, the companion of Paul. And John was written by the disciple John. Tertullian, writing around 200 AD in North Africa, tells us that the documents of the Gospels were written by the apostles Matthew and John and apostolic men of Luke and Mark. Prior to that, St. Irenaeus of Lyons tells us Matthew wrote a gospel among the Jews in their own style, while Paul and Peter were preaching in Rome. Then Mark, the disciple of Peter, handed to us the preaching of Peter. Then Luke, a follower of Paul, set forth his own gospel. Later, John, the disciple of the Lord, put out a gospel while residing in Ephesus. So Irenaeus tells us John wrote later than the other three, implying the first three were possibly written around the same time. Clement of Alexandria, writing in Egypt around the same time as Irenaeus, tells us the Gospels with the genealogies came first. Mark was done at request while Peter was preaching in Rome, and that John came last at the urging of friends. So we get the same idea that Irenaeus tells us, that the first three were written around the same time, and John came last. The Muratorian fragment, which dates to the middle of the 2nd century, is a list of an early canon. The first page was lost, however the second page starts with, "at which nevertheless he was present," and so he placed them in his narrative. The third book of the Gospel is that according to Luke, Luke the well-known physician. The fourth of the Gospels is that of John, one of the disciples, to his fellow disciples and bishops who had been urging him to write. So we are told Luke was third, John was last, and it starts with the same idea church fathers tell us, that Mark was present while Peter was preaching in Rome and wrote down what Peter taught, although the names on the first page are lost. Preserved in Eusebius' Ecclesiastical History is a quote from Papias of Hierapolis, written before 125 AD. This too the elder used to say, Mark, who had been Peter's interpreter, wrote down carefully but not in order all that he remembered of the Lord's sayings and doings, for he had not heard the Lord or had been one of his followers, but later, as I said, one of Peter's. Peter used to adapt his teachings to the occasion without making a systematic arrangement of the Lord's sayings, so that Mark was quite justified in writing down some things just as he had remembered them. For he had had one purpose only, to leave out nothing that he had heard, and to make no misstatement about it. He also says Matthew wrote the Logia in the Hebrew dialect. To whether Papias was referring to the Gospel of Matthew, or an older list of sayings of Jesus, sometimes referred to by scholars as Q, we do not know. Tim McGrew makes an excellent point regarding all this external evidence. If you plot all four church fathers on a map, you see we have wide attestation of the authors of the Gospels from all over the ancient world. This is the kind of testimony we dream of receiving with other ancient documents. When we have multiple authors in different regions all telling us the same general story, we have excellent evidence the Gospels were written by those who they are attributed to. On top of this, we have no other tradition or testimony which attributes authorship to anyone else. There is no competing tradition. Plus, if the Church Fathers just made up authors to attribute to the four Gospels, why is there not unanimous attestation to who wrote Hebrews? Hebrews is truly anonymous, and Church Fathers had to try to guess as to who the author was. If they made up the authors of the Gospels, why not do the same with Hebrews? And also, why not give all four Gospels prominent names? Surely they could have done better than Mark and Luke, who never met Jesus and were later disciples of the apostles. If you're just making it all up, why not pick two of the other disciples? It would have made the Gospels look better instead of attributing them to men who were never considered church founders or disciples of Jesus. Some skeptics try to claim the Gospels cannot be trusted because they do not mention the authors internally, but this was how the majority of ancient biographies were written. The majority of works from the ancient world have to be externally attributed. E.P. Sanders says, "The claim of an anonymous history was higher than that of a named work. In the ancient world, an anonymous book, rather like an encyclopedia article today, implicitly claimed complete knowledge and reliability. It would have reduced the impact of the Gospel of Matthew had the author written, 'This is my version,' instead of, 'This is what Jesus said and did.' So looking at the external evidence, we have good evidence they are written by the apostles and men who they are attributed to. so the claim of later impostors is without evidence and unwarranted. So if we compare this external authorship for the Gospels with other ancient works, we can see how much better off the New Testament is compared to these others. The first person to attribute the Annals to Tacitus is not until St. Jerome. Thucydides' works are not attributed to him until Polybius, over 200 years later. Whereas with the New Testament, we have multiple authors within 150 years, and one author who is less than 50 years from the source, who even testified there were still living disciples in his day. Moving on, we have a lot of good evidence the first three Gospels can be dated to prior to 70 AD. First, none of the Gospels directly mention the destruction of the temple, and this is inconsistent with their style of pointing out things that happened after the fact. For example, when all four Gospels mention Judas for the first time, they all make the note that he later became a traitor. So when the Gospels talk about past predictions or events, they are keen to mention the later effects, like that Judas would later become a traitor. In Acts 11, Luke mentions the prediction of a coming famine, then notes this happened during the reign of Claudius. In John chapter 2, we see a conversation between Jesus and the Jews, where Jesus speaks of raising up his body after 3 days. In verse 22, John mentions what Jesus was speaking about was when Jesus was raised from the dead. All these examples indicate that when the Gospels mention something spoken in the past and having been fulfilled by the time they were writing, they would mention that it had already taken place. However, it is clear Jesus predicted the destruction of the temple as recorded in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They simply mention that Jesus predicted this, yet do not indicate it has already happened. This seems inconsistent with their style of mentioning when something was fulfilled or later occurred by the time they wrote, especially with Matthew, who loved to mention Old Testament passages that were fulfilled in his lifetime. Second, the language of the Gospels and Acts indicates they were written in a pre-persecution time. In 64 AD, the first great Christian persecution began. Christians were fed to wild animals, burned alive, tortured, and crucified. Because of this, anti-Roman works like the Revelation of John and the forged Apocalypse of Peter were produced, which didn't paint Rome in a good light or speak well of their persecutors later in hell. Scholars note these works represent the anguish Christians were feeling during and after great persecutions, and the new anger they now had for their Roman persecutors. However, in the Gospels and Acts, we do not see the same attitude towards Rome. Luke often paints Romans in a good light, such as a Roman who rescued Paul from dying at the hands of Jews, and another later treating Paul kindly, as well as a Roman centurion who comes to Jesus for help. Mark portrayed a Roman centurion as one of the few at the cross who understood Jesus was the Son of God. Rome is never really made out to be the enemy in the Gospels or Acts, but the focus is more on the Jewish sects, who were persecuting them long before Rome started. Thus, this indicates an early dating for these documents. Third, external and internal evidence both indicate Matthew was writing to a Jewish audience. However, the destruction of the temple in 70 AD wiped out the large Jewish population and scattered the remaining. If Matthew was written after 70 AD, to whom was he writing? There lacked a centralized group his gospel would have been directed at. Furthermore, Matthew mentions details that would only matter to a Jewish population still centered in Jerusalem, such as the field Judas hanged himself in. John Wyndham says, some of the apologetic, like the account of the suicide of Judas and the account of the guard at the tomb, seems of no great theological significance, yet of particular interest to those who frequented Jerusalem. It makes more sense Matthew was writing a gospel for Jews in Judea prior to 70 AD. Fourth, in Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, Richard Bauckham cites evidence that many elements of Mark fit with a community prior to 70 AD. One aspect pointed out is the Gospels are filled with names, which represent an authoritative list of witnesses people could question to verify the Gospel accounts. However, in many places in the Synoptic Gospels, many key eyewitnesses are left anonymous. Scholars like Gerd Thiessen and Craig Evans point out key witnesses were left anonymous for their protection, since they still could have been prosecuted by the Jewish authorities. For example, in Mark, we are told someone cut off the ear of a soldier in trying to protect Jesus, and in retelling of the story, he is left anonymous for his protection, since if his name was told, the Jewish authorities, who still had power in Jerusalem, could arrest him for attacking a soldier. However, by the time John is written, we find out it is Peter, thus telling us that by the time John was written, which is the last gospel, keeping Peter's identity secret was no longer necessary, as by this time the Jews had lost their power in Jerusalem. Thus the Passion narrative in Mark must be placed prior to 70 AD. As Gerd Thiessen says, only in Jerusalem was there a reason to draw a cloak of anonymity over followers of Jesus who had endangered themselves by their actions. The date could also be pinpointed. Parts of the Passion account would have to have been composed within the generation of the eyewitnesses and their contemporaries, that is, somewhere between 30 and 60 AD. Bachman cites several other examples that Mark keeps anonymous for their protection, telling us parts of Mark were written early, and while the Sanhedrin still had power in Jerusalem. Fifth, and most importantly, look at how the book of Acts ends. The final section is a build-up to Paul's trial in Rome. Several chapters are spent building up for Paul to head to Rome and face trial. However, Acts ends with Paul arriving in Rome and the statement, he lived there 2 years at his own expense. There is no mention of his trial or if he was ever released or not. The climactic build just ends without a payoff. It is agreed Paul arrived in Rome in 60 AD based on the fact that Acts mentions a change in procurator from Felix to Festus, which dates to 59 AD. Acts records it was Festus that sent Paul for trial in Rome. Thus, if Acts ends 2 years later with Paul still waiting for trial in Rome, it would seem that is when Acts was completed. Otherwise, why would Luke build up to a climactic trial only to leave his readers guessing if Paul was released or not? Tradition teaches Paul was released at this time, so it would have been the perfect note to end on, and Paul was finally released and headed back out to preach the gospel once again, as the Lord instructed. So the likely possibility is that Acts was completed before the trial, which probably disappointed his readers, but is good historical data for us today. Luke also begins Acts by mentioning this is his second book. Therefore his gospel would have been written before Acts and before 62 AD. This would imply Mark was also written earlier, since Luke was mostly based off of Mark. Thus we have plenty of evidence that at least the first 3 Gospels and Acts were written before 70 AD and even before 62 AD. Therefore, from internal and external evidence, we can estimate when they were completed. Church fathers tell us Mark was written in Rome and is the account of Peter's preaching. Emperor Claudius expelled the Jews from Rome in 49 AD, but the decree would have ended in 54 AD when Claudius died. This would have allowed Peter and Mark to go to Rome and preach. However, Peter probably didn't go to Rome right away, since Paul's letter to the Romans, which is dated to 56 AD, doesn't mention or greet Peter. Yet Paul greets dozens of others by name. It is unlikely he would have left Peter out. Thus Mark was most likely written after 56 AD, when Peter would have arrived, so probably between 57 and 60 AD. Luke mentions he gathered sources for his gospel in the first chapter, which most likely would have happened while Paul was in prison under Felix in Judea. This would have allowed Luke to acquire the sources for his gospels by speaking and meeting with the early church. However, internal evidence indicates Luke relied heavily on Mark. Therefore, completion would not have happened until Paul and Luke arrived in Rome, where he could draw from Mark the account of Peter and his own sources to finalize a gospel between 60 and 62 AD, as well as write Acts. Now, Eusebius cites a tradition that Peter went to Rome in the 40s under Claudius to deal with the heretic Simon Magnus. It is possible Mark was with him there, and Mark could have written as early as the 40s. This would tentatively move Luke back as well. However, neither of these are necessary and it lacks extensive data. Whether Matthew existed prior to Mark or is based off of Mark is debatable. Most scholars believe Matthew was based on Mark. However, from external evidence, there is a possibility Matthew was the first gospel written. Early church historian Eusebius places Matthew as early as 41 AD. However, other church fathers like Irenaeus seem to suggest a later date. Therefore, Matthew was probably written in Judea somewhere around the 50s and 60s in Aramaic, and was later translated in Greek. Some internal evidence may suggest John was written before 70 AD. John 5:2 speaks in present tense of a sheep gate by a pool in Jerusalem, which would not have been there if John was writing after 70 AD. However, external evidence suggests John was written after his exile, and after he completed Revelation. External evidence also indicates John lived well into old age, so he could have written as late as 96 AD. However, the Muratorian fragment says the disciple Andrew was with John when he wrote his Gospel, and it is unlikely Andrew would have also lived as long as John. Therefore, John could be dated anywhere between 66 and 96 AD. Church Father Papias, in his statement that Matthew wrote the Logia, may be referring to an early collection of Jesus' acts and statements, which scholars refer to as Q. If this document did exist, it would predate the Gospels, and the writing of it probably would have started during the ministry of Jesus. Matthew, being a tax collector, would not only have known Greek and Aramaic, but would also have access to papyrus for writing. However, there is no agreement on what Q would have contained, and there is not good evidence it even existed. Plus, a study of oral tradition shows it wasn't necessary. The dating of most of Paul's letters is not speculative, as there are generally agreed upon dates. However, we will discuss the other New Testament books in more detail in another series where we can look at each book individually. Generally speaking, though, there is plenty of evidence to date the Gospels and the rest of the New Testament books reasonably within the apostles' lifetimes, and there is no reason to doubt their authorship. If the New Testament was written by eyewitnesses and is not a fabrication from later imposters, then they should be able to get most of their facts right about that time period. In other words, in telling of the history and ministry of Jesus and the apostles, the author should be able to paint Jesus in the correct culture, region, and with other historical figures. So they should get the names of towns, rulers, cultural aspects, geography, and customs correct. Like, for example, if someone from the year 3000 discovered a book about the history of our time, to know whether it was written by an authentic eyewitness of this culture and not an impostor from a few centuries later, the author should be able to get several facts right. Like they should not mix up the order of presidents, place cities in the wrong state, or ascribe customs from the 1800s to the 21st century. In the same way, if the New Testament was written by eyewitnesses of the ministry of Jesus from 1st century Judea, they should get their facts correct about the region and culture. Likewise, the broad historical facts in the Gospels should be confirmed by other historical sources. And when we look at the evidence, this is exactly what we see. We find multiple secular sources attesting to the life and ministry of Jesus, confirmation in archaeological finds, and how the New Testament perfectly coheres with ancient history. Starting with the first one, we actually have 7 sources outside of the New Testament which mention the existence of Jesus. 3 major ones go even further. Tacitus, writing around 100 AD, says that Rome suffered a great fire in 64 AD, and many blame the Emperor Nero. To get rid of the rumors, Tacitus says, "Hence to suppress the rumors, he falsely charged with the guilt, and punished with the most exquisite tortures, the persons commonly called Christians, who were hated for their enormities. Christus, the founder of the name, was put to death by Pontius Pilate, procurator of Judea, in the reign of Tiberius." As you can see, Tacitus is a hostile witness, which means his testimony meets the criteria of embarrassment, and he confirms what the New Testament says, that Jesus existed, that he was put to death, and by Pontius Pilate, was ruling in Judea under Emperor Tiberius. So Tacitus attests to 5 facts that align with the accounts in the New Testament. Another historian by the name of Josephus says of Christ, "Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as receive the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive, again the 3rd day, as the divine prophets had foretold, these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. And the tribe of Christians so named for him are not extinct at this day." Now the odd thing about this passage is Josephus was a Jew, not a Christian, yet he says Jesus was the Christ and confirms the resurrection. Because of this, scholars agree this passage has been interpolated, which means a later Christian scribe doctored it. However, that doesn't mean the entire passage is a fraud, and in fact most scholars think it is original and just slightly doctored. And fortunately we have textual evidence to confirm this. In 1971, an Arabic version of this passage from Josephus was found, and it reads like this. "At this time there was a wise man, who was called Jesus, and his conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous, and many people from among the Jews and the other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die, and those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them after his crucifixion, and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets had recounted wonders." So as I said, most scholars accept this passage was interpolated, and was originally more like what is found in the Arabic manuscript. Josephus also confirms in other sections that the brother of Jesus was James, and that John the Baptist was beheaded by Herod Antipas. Therefore, Josephus confirms New Testament facts that Jesus existed, he was a good and moral teacher, that many people followed him, he was put to death by Pilate by crucifixion. After his death, his disciples believe he appeared to them. They continued to preach his message. James was his brother. John the Baptist existed and was put to death by Herod Antipas. The Babylonian Talmud says, "On the eve of Passover they hanged Yeshua, and an announcer went out in front of him for 40 days saying, 'He is going to be stoned because he practiced sorcery and enticed and led Israel astray. Anyone who knows anything in his favor, let him come and plead in his behalf.' but not having found anything in his favor, they hanged him on the eve of Passover. The Talmud confirms the Jews wanted to stone Jesus, that he was crucified around Passover, and that he led many Jews away from the religious authorities. There is also an implication a trial happened, and the Talmud confirms Jesus was believed to be a miracle worker by accusing him of sorcery. This meets the criteria of embarrassment, since they have to admit it was believed Jesus had some supernatural power, but accuse it of coming from an evil source. This is why most historians accept Jesus was believed to be a miracle worker. As Graham Twelftree says, there is now almost unanimous agreement among Jesus questers that the historical Jesus performed mighty works. Even the Jesus Seminar lists among their basic facts about Jesus that he was a charismatic healer and exorcist. Thus we have several facts from these three sources, which confirm the broad historical facts of the New Testament. Finally, there is evidence in a citation from Africanus that the historians Pelagian and Thallus mention the period of darkness that happened around the time of Christ's death. He says, Thallus, in the third book of his Histories, explains away the darkness as an eclipse of the sun unreasonably. Pelagian appears to have said, during the time of Tiberius Caesar, an eclipse of the sun occurred during the full moon. Therefore, we have extra-biblical sources for the period of darkness in the New Testament. And also, we have a large amount of facts in the New Testament confirmed by other sources. The second section of external evidence comes from archaeological finds. The majority of what we find in archaeology confirms the biblical account, backing up the claim the New Testament is reliable.
But by and large, 85 to 90% of the discoveries being made in any land of the biblical world today almost immediately agrees with the biblical record. You can quarrel over the 10 or 15% if you want. But most of the archaeological discoveries affirm the biblical record.
There is so much data it would be impossible to go over it all. However, there are important finds we should mention. In the 1800s, several skeptics doubted the existence of Pilate, but in 1961 an inscription was found in Caesarea, which reads, "To Tiberius Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea," confirming the historical existence of Pilate, and that he was ruling in Judea under Tiberius, as Luke records. Skeptics also used to say Luke hadn't a clue what he was talking about, because he records Licinius was the tetrarch of Abilene under Tiberius. But we know from history Licinius lived earlier than that as tetrarch of Clausus. However, an inscription discovered at Albia, dating to the time of Tiberius, names Licinius as tetrarch, just as Luke had written. There were in fact two government officials named Licinius, and Luke was correct all along. In fact, we discovered archaeological evidence for many of the rulers Luke mentions, like Herod the Great, Herod Antipas, Gallio the proconsul of Achaia from Acts 18. Many figures mentioned in the New Testament have been discovered in archaeology, such as Erastus, the treasurer at Corinth, mentioned in Paul's letter to the Romans. In 1941, more ossuaries were discovered, one bearing the name Alexandros, son of Simon, and the ossuaries may contain a misspelling of Cyrenian. If so, this would be another historical figure mentioned in the New Testament. Even closer to Jesus, in Hierapolis, archaeologists believe they have found the lost tomb of Philip the Apostle. However, a major discovery came recently, when the family tomb of Caiaphas was discovered, confirming his existence as well. We also have discovered archaeological evidence of Bethlehem and Nazareth, despite them being small towns, as well as Capernaum. Also in Capernaum, we found evidence of a magnificent synagogue and a Roman presence, just as the New Testament testifies. In Jerusalem, we have found archaeological evidence for the remains of a pool of Bethesda and a pool of Siloam. We've also found a Galilean fishing boat, which perfectly fits the description in the New Testament. Again, there's so much to go over, it would be impossible to mention it all here, but I want to mention three more important discoveries. Recently it was reported that we found the likely place of Jesus' trial in Jerusalem's Old City. Shimon Gibson says, "There is of course no inscription stating it happened here, but everything, archaeological, historical, and gospel accounts, all fall into place, and it makes sense. Even more important, excavations in Judea reveal that an earthquake happened around the time of Jesus' crucifixion. It was reported, researching the deeper layers of the soil, 2 earthquakes were detected by looking at the layers of built-up sediment, called varves, which build up each year. A widespread earthquake is known to have happened in 31 BC, and another one was detected, which must have occurred between 26 and 36 AD. They registered at a 6.3 magnitude, and that would have been capable of causing the structural damage to tombs, rocks, and the temple, as recorded in the Gospels. This coheres with the biblical account that an earthquake happened at this time. The final piece of evidence may be our first archaeological discovery which mentions the existence of Jesus. In 2002, an ossuary was discovered with the inscription, "James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus." Dr. André Lumière evaluated the ossuary and stated the cursive Aramaic script is consistent with 1st century lettering, and it was not made with modern tools. The odds of an ossuary mentioning a brother is very unlikely, unless that brother was a famous person. And the Biblical Archaeology Review also looked at the plausibility and said from this time period there would be 1.71 people named James with a brother named Jesus and a father named Joseph, making it extremely likely that if it is authentic, it would belong to St. James of Jerusalem. However, in 2003, Israeli Antiquities Authority published its report that the ossuary was authentic, but the inscription was a modern forgery. But the problem is their report left many holes. Professor Wolfgang Krumbein analyzed the ossuary and concluded their paper originates from a series of errors, bias, mistaken premises, use of inappropriate methodology, mistaken geochemistry, defective error control, reliance on unconfirmed data, and a disregard of information. And other later studies concluded the inscription was authentic, including a 2014 study which found the microfossils in the inscription were naturally deposited. New Testament scholar Ben Witherington remarked, "As seems probable, the ossuary found in the vicinity of Jerusalem and dated to about AD 63 is indeed the burial box of James, the brother of Jesus. The inscription is the most important extra-biblical evidence of its kind. Thus, as the evidence indicates, we have the authentic ossuary of James, the brother of Jesus, and this means we have an archaeological inscription which bears the name of Jesus from the 1st century. Thus, the external evidence in archaeology strongly supports the biblical account and its reliability." The final section of external evidence is to look at how well the New Testament coheres and fits with the rest of ancient history. When this evidence piles up, it easily refutes to claim the New Testament was written by later forgers, and demonstrates that gospel writers were intimately familiar with the culture they were writing about. For example, in Matthew 17, Jesus is approached by Peter to pay a temple tax of 2 drachma. Jesus teaches him a lesson and tells him where he can find the amount for himself and Jesus to pay the tax. Peter goes to the sea and finds a shekel, which in ancient Rome was equal to 4 drachma. Thus Matthew records the appropriate currency exchange, that 1 shekel is equal to 4 drachma. Now why is this important? Because it's an example they knew what they were talking about. If I told you to tell me the proper currency exchange in Mexico 80 years ago, could you do it? And remember, you must do it without modern technology, like the internet or extensive libraries. The odds are very slim. In the same way, when the gospel writers get details like this, it matters. Because if they were written by later forgers, after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, which dramatically changed the culture, they would make numerous errors and demonstrate they were not part of that culture, but later frauds. A good example is Philostratus' life of Apollonius. Philostratus, writing around 200 AD, attempts to make up the life of a sage from the 1st century, and utterly fails. Scholars recognize dozens of errors which show the mark of a later forger, such as having Apollonius talk with kings in Babylon, yet in the 1st century Babylon was still in ruins. His trip to India is completely incompatible with known facts. Most scholars recognize that Apollonius is a made-up pagan sage based on Jesus, and is meant to give the pagans their own miracle worker. So if the Gospels were written by later forgers, it would be easy for them to mix up facts and show they were not organically part of 1st century Palestine and Greece, like how Philostratus wasn't. However, we find over and over again that the New Testament writers get facts correct constantly, demonstrating they were intimately familiar with the culture of that time. To show how much they got right, Nathaniel Lardner wrote Credibility of the Gospel History, which documents detail after detail of what the New Testament authors got right. However, it's 17 volumes long, so the amount of details they got right is unprecedented. That doesn't happen if you're a later forger, like the tale of Apollonius demonstrates. And writing about 1st century Judea is no cakewalk. Just look at how the governance changed. First, Herod the Great ruled a united kingdom, but then his kingdom is divided between 3 sons. Archelaus is never certified as king, but is allowed to reign. Then Archelaus is removed, and Judea is reduced to a Roman province, run by prefects. But the religious leaders are still allowed some role in military power. However, in 36 AD, Pilate is removed, and replaced with others, which lasts until Herod Agrippa is given kingship of the region. He lasts a few years and then dies, and is replaced by a system of procurators. However, Herod Agrippa II later is given some power in Judea, but it is limited. The whole issue is very confusing, and has befuddled even some Roman historians. However, the Gospel writers tiptoe easily through this political mess, where it is easy to make a mistake and show you have no clue what you're talking about. Yet they constantly get the changes in government correct, even up to the point of saying Archelaus was not a king, but only reigning as one. A later forger would have likely messed this up. Another good point is the issue of crucifixion and burial. The depiction of Jesus' crucifixion correlates to known facts about it, such as carrying one's cross and being nailed to it. Many skeptics used to think the Gospels were wrong in their depiction of someone being nailed to a cross. However, in 1968, an ossuary was found containing the burial remains of a Jewish man named Yohanan, containing a 7-inch nail driven through both his feet. His legs were also crushed, confirming the practice of breaking the victim's legs. Skeptics like Dale Martin have tried to argue Jesus wouldn't have been allowed to be given a proper burial. However, the fact that Yohanan was given one challenges this claim. Josephus also tells us that prior to 70 AD, crucified victims were allowed to be given a proper burial. Thus, the biblical description of crucifixion and burial fits well with what the historical record tells us. In the book Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, Richard Bauckham compares the amount of names used in the Gospels with that of what we found on ancient Palestinian gravestones, ancient records, and on ossuaries. He finds the ratio of names in the Gospels correlates almost perfectly to the ratio of names the rest of the historical record reveals. In both cases, Simon and Joseph are the most popular male names. The other 9 most popular male names correlate as well. The 2 most popular female names, Mary and Salome, and the other 9 most popular female names correlate almost as close as well. Thus it seems remarkable if the Gospels were written by later forgers, they coincidentally got the use of name percentages right as well. It fits far better with the fact that they were actually writing about events in a culture they were eyewitnesses to. Otherwise, these facts would not be piling up one after another. This can be seen in what Colin Hemmer does. He lists 84 facts the book of Acts gets right in its final 16 chapters. And when you look at the facts it gets right, it shows Luke was very familiar with the culture and knows what he was talking about. Luke gets the proper names of ports, local industries of certain regions, the proper lines of boundaries, slang terminology, specific landmarks, local variations in languages, and the proper titles for regional and local officials. For example, he knows the governor of Cyprus is called a proconsul, while in Philippi they are referred to as governors. Meanwhile in Thessalonica they are referred to as politarchs or rulers. In Ephesus, the chief magistrate is called the town clerk. The ruler in Malta is called the chief man. In Athens, Areopagites is a title for a member of their court, and so on and so on. You do not get this kind of accuracy unless you are very familiar with what actually took place, and you do not get that unless you are or work directly for the eyewitnesses of the events. Craig Bloomberg does the same with the book of John and lists 59 facts John gets right about ancient Judea. And there is still Lardner's 17-volume work waiting for you if you want to see the overwhelming amount of facts they get right, which is way too much to list here. However, my research partner was nice enough to pull the 41 facts William Paley lists in his book, which is the cliff notes on Lardner's work, and we place them in a blog post below so you can go through them and see the overwhelming amount of facts they get right. All of this just piles up to show the New Testament writers knew what they were talking about, and over again they got their facts right, affirming the reliability of the New Testament. The external facts and archaeological discoveries constantly confirm the biblical account in almost every way. The evidence once again affirms the New Testament as a reliable document. Some of the most overlooked pieces of evidence for the reliability of the New Testament is internal evidence. In contrast to external evidence, which looks at how well the New Testament conforms with outside facts, these arguments look at clues within the New Testament that speak to its reliability. In other words, if the New Testament is reliable and trustworthy, then it should contain a large amount of internal clues that confirm this. We've already looked at 2 sections of internal evidence. In Part 3, we looked at how the New Testament preserves a controlled oral tradition that is unlikely to have been fabricated. And in Part 4, we looked at the internal evidence, which suggests an early dating for many of the New Testament books, and puts them very close to the ministry of Jesus. So in this video, we'll look at 3 other pieces of internal evidence, such as excessive non-theological verbiage, the criteria of embarrassment, and undesigned coincidences. So diving right in, we'll start with the first one, of excessive non-theological verbiage. This piece of evidence speaks to the unlikeliness the New Testament was made up as later myths, or was later intentionally corrupted by scribes. For example, Throughout Paul's epistles, there are verses which have no theological or spiritual significance, such as Paul mentioning he will be visiting the Corinthian church, but he'll stay in Ephesus for a time, or that Paul wastes time to instruct Timothy to bring him his cloak and his books. In the Gospels as well, there are entire passages with no theological teaching, such as a group of women named in Luke 8 that followed Jesus, or mentioning that Simon was father of Alexander and Rufus. These passages would have been unlikely to have been made up at a later date if you're just making up stories and theological teachings, because they would only matter to specific people very early on and carry no lasting theological significance for later generations. Yet the epistles are filled with verses like this. What would the reasons be for including these verses if the New Testament was made up by later generations to teach theology through myth? Including them was an unnecessary waste of your precious space, unless of course the New Testament is not a myth, and Paul was actually writing to the Corinthian church, and these unnecessary verses were included because they mattered to the people Paul was writing directly to. Second, the fact that verses like these are included speak to the integrity of later scribes. If a scribe was only concerned with preserving the sections of scripture that mattered, we would expect passages like these to have been removed. Now some may object that it would not have been too hard to simply copy these sections as well, but we need to remember to not read scripture with a modern lens. Papyrus in ink 2,000 years ago was not cheap like it is today. To copy and preserve a document was an expensive endeavor. Papyrus the size of Mark's Gospel or 1 Corinthians alone cost roughly 2 denarii, and a day's wage was 1 denarii. So to obtain the money for just one papyrus, you would need to work at least 2 full days, and possibly more. Something for the size of Luke or Mark would cost about 5 denarii. Then that doesn't even include ink and the time it takes to write. If you don't know how to write, you would need to hire a scribe on top of that. So this was not an easy process like it is today. This was a full-blown project that would cost a lot of money and time. Yet despite this, copyists kept this unnecessary excessive language that does not apply to their generation, when it would have been easier, cheaper, and less time-consuming to simply cut out these parts. Plus, considering the amount of room a papyrus has, the unnecessary passages could have been removed and replaced with more important doctrines scribes thought should have been in the originals. This would have been the perfect place to add and make up possible sayings of Jesus to deal with later issues the church struggled with, like if Christians needed to be circumcised, or what was the place of speaking in tongues, or when to celebrate Easter. But instead of doing this for their convenience and ease, we find this unnecessary language that would only have mattered to the original readers. And these later issues the church struggled with were not resolved by making up Jesus' sayings, when it would have been the easiest thing to do. This shows Christian scribes were more concerned with preserving these documents at their own expense and effort than only preserving what was theologically important to them and using the extra space to insert convenient lies. So the next section looks at passages in the New Testament that fit the criteria of embarrassment. Scholars note that if a passage is embarrassing to the author who wrote it, it is likely to be true, since the author would have preferred the event had never happened, yet feel the need to report it anyway. And in fact, when we look at the New Testament, we can point to dozens of examples, like how Acts and 1 Corinthians report challenges the early church faced and wrestled with. The fact the New Testament writers mention these disputes testifies to the probability that they actually happened. Now some disagree with this and claim that the existence of embarrassing passages doesn't make something true. Well, obviously, no one claimed that just because something is embarrassing for the original author, it is automatically true. The criteria of embarrassment adds evidence something is more likely true. But of course, if there is stronger evidence favoring its falsehood, then the embarrassment factor is outweighed. Yet that doesn't mean the criteria of embarrassment should be completely disregarded, as historians still consider it a valid tool to use in our cumulative investigation of history. Sometimes embarrassing passages can be created for moral or theological reasons. Like for example in Romans 7, Paul speaks of his inability to do the good. A skeptic can point out that even though this passage seems embarrassing, it is used for theological teachings and has a purpose. So it could have been invented for that specific purpose. So what we need to ask is if there are sections of the New Testament that are embarrassing and have little to no theological significance. And in fact we can point to many places, like the example we just spoke about. If you're inventing theology that Christians don't need to be circumcised, it would be far easier to just invent a saying of Jesus on this, instead of claiming the church split over the issue, a council had to be called, and they had to hack out their differences. This is much more embarrassing than simply saying you were enlightened by the Holy Spirit on the issue. The same can be applied to the issues the Corinthian church faced. Also in the Gospels, there doesn't seem to be a good reason to make up the fact that Jesus was buried in the tomb of a Sanhedrin member. For the early church, the Sanhedrin was corrupt, had unjustly crucified their Messiah, and was the enemy of the early church. To admit they could not supply their own tomb for Jesus, and had to use a tomb of a group who hated and persecuted them, is an unlikely invention that doesn't have much to teach, outside of the possibility the author is just reporting history as it happened. The Gospels also give a prominent role to the women followers of Jesus. In the modern world, such a thing would hardly be questioned, but to ancient people, women were considered untrustworthy. The Talmud says, any evidence which a woman gives is not valid to offer. Yet all four Gospels report the women were the first to discover the empty tomb. If this was an invention, it would not have helped the early Christians theologically in any way, since the testimony of women was not trusted, and Christian opponents like Celsus used this fact against them. This embarrassing fact was not something you'd invent for any reason. As N.T. Wright says, as historians we are obliged to comment that if these stories had been made up 5 years later, let alone 30, 40, or 50 years later, they would never have had Mary Magdalene in this role. To put Mary there is, from the point of view of Christian apologists wanting to explain to a skeptical audience that Jesus really did rise from the dead, like shooting themselves in the foot. But to us as historians, this kind of thing is gold dust. The early Christians would never have made this up. In fact, there are several instances we can look at that fit the criteria of embarrassment. The fact that the New Testament writers mention things that are embarrassing supports the idea they were reporting history as it happened, instead of making up stories to suit their needs. So the next piece of evidence is one of the most overlooked, yet has recently been given a new resurgence from apologist and philosopher Tim McGrew. Undesigned coincidences are the opposite of supposed Bible contradictions. Skeptics try to make a big splash in claiming the Bible is full of contradictions, and in another series we've begun to address these one at a time. But no one seems to realize the Bible is filled with undesigned coincidences, which are claims or facts different accounts mention, which overlap and confirm entirely other claims made independently, or they fill in gaps in different accounts left as loose ends by one author. Now this sounds a bit abstract, but you'll see what I mean when we look at some examples. Look at Matthew 8. We are told Jesus healed Peter's mother. Then we are told that evening they brought Jesus more people to be healed. But the question is, why did they wait until evening? Why not rush on the opportunity? Well, Mark reports the same event, yet ties up this loose end by telling us Jesus entered the house of Simon on the Sabbath, so they would have had to wait till the evening when the Sabbath ended. A similar thing happens in Luke, who reports they told no one what they saw after the transfiguration. But why wouldn't they tell anyone? Well, Mark supplies the reason is that Jesus instructed them not to. So these are good examples of how undesigned coincidences work. In one account there is a loose end that is tied up in another account, which tells us the accounts fit together in reporting the same event. Now skeptics might respond that Matthew and Luke were simply stealing their stories from Mark and forgot to include those details. Well, that is possible. However, undesigned coincidences are not built on one or two examples, but on a collection of places showing the Gospels confirm each other, so more are needed to present an adequate case. Another example can be seen in a detail Mark leaves out. Mark 6 reports the feeding of 5,000, and it reads that many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. So Jesus called his followers out to a desolate place, and then Jesus commanded them to sit down on green grass. This is odd for two reasons. One being Palestine doesn't get a lot of green grass, and it is not explained why it's so crowded that they needed to retreat to a desolate place. Well, luckily we are given the answer in John, because it records the feeding of the 5,000 happened around Passover, which means it happened in spring during the growing season, which explains why the grass was green. Plus, since Passover brought thousands of pilgrims, it explains why it was so crowded that Jesus and his followers had to retreat into the wilderness. It doesn't seem likely that John invented this to explain away Mark, because John doesn't mention that it was Passover in order to explain why the grass was green or why it was overcrowded. In fact, he leaves both these points out and only mentions it was Passover in passing. So we have an instance of where John unintentionally explains Mark twice. John 6:5 says Jesus asked Philip, "Where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat?" It is never explained why of all people Jesus asked Philip. If I was making this story up, the most likely disciple to pick would have been Judas, since he held the money. However, if we begin to connect the dots, we see Luke unintentionally explains John. Luke 9 tells us the feeding of the 5,000 happened in Bethsaida, which connects with John, because later on John tells us Philip was from Bethsaida. But unlike Luke, John doesn't tell us the event happened in Bethsaida. Only with the help of Luke is this loose end tied up in John, as to why Jesus asked Philip of all his disciples. Another one related to this is that in Matthew, Jesus speaks a woe on the region of Bethsaida, and speaks of a mighty work done there. However, up to this point in his gospel, Matthew never mentions any mighty works done in Bethsaida. Only from Luke do we find out the feeding of the 5,000 happened before the woes are given, so Luke explains a passage in Matthew. Luke also confirms something in Matthew 14, 1-2. We are told Herod was talking with his servants and worrying if Jesus was John the Baptist raised from the dead. The question arises, how did Matthew know what Herod was talking about in his palace? Well, Luke unintentionally gives us the answer. In a totally different context, Luke tells us a follower of Jesus was Johanna, the wife of Chuza, Herod's household manager. Thus we have an answer as to how it was possible the Christians were able to get inside information on Herod. In Mark 15, we are told the Jews are accusing Jesus of claiming he would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. But in none of the synoptic gospels are we told where they got this claim from. However, in John 2, in a totally different context, we are told Jesus was speaking metaphorically about his body after cleansing the temple, of raising it up after 3 days. So we have an instance of John confirming Mark and where the Jews got their distorted accusation from. Before this happened, Jesus was brought before Pilate. The Jews said Jesus is claiming to be a king, which would be a crime under Roman law since only Caesar was king. So Pilate asked Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus answered him, "You have said so." Then Pilate says to the crowds, "I find no guilt in this man." This doesn't make sense. Jesus admits to the charge, and Pilate says he is not guilty? So something is either wrong or missing. Luckily in John we are given the context. Pilate brings Jesus in and asks him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus replies, "My kingdom is not of this world," which is another way of saying his kingdom was that of the Spirit, which is not a challenge to Caesar's physical kingdom. This shows us nothing Luke says is incorrect, but John gives us the context as to why it makes sense. But not only does John confirm Luke, but Luke also confirms John, because John doesn't give us the accusation from the Jews, which explains why Pilate would even ask Jesus if he was king of the Jews. So both accounts confirm each other in an intricate way. Luke gives us the accusation, and John gives us the answer from Jesus as to why he is innocent. Therefore, we can see the Gospels interlock and confirm each other nicely. And there are even more examples McGrew gives us. If these were all myths, we would not find coincidences like these, which explain away loose ends unintentionally, nor would there even be a need to leave loose ends. If you're writing fiction, you're simply making up facts to suit your needs, and there's no need to leave loose ends, like you are if you're constrained by reality, since everything is subject to your imagination. But these undesigned coincidences support the idea the Gospel writers were reporting history and not making up myths, otherwise they would not interlock. It is important to note I have only scratched the surface of internal evidence. We haven't even looked at the criteria of dissimilarity or the criteria of multiple forms, among many other internal marks of authenticity.